Because of the sensitive nature of his job, Daniel thinks it's best to temporarily remain anonymous. Daniel was not just any atheist. He was an outspoken, aggressive, condescending, arrogant skeptic.
This is January 19th, 2015 at 7:11 p.m. Daniel writes to Eric and says, I've been watching your presuppositional debates recently. I have to admit, I think you're the best and possibly last game in town for Christian apologetics. It's kind of brilliant how you cut the legs out from underneath your opponent and then say you don't have to follow their rules. It says a lot that you aren't willing to talk about science or evidence. That's what leads me to believe this might be the last stand for you guys.
Welcome to the Creation Today Show, where we bring together interviews with experts and solid Bible teaching. Your host, Eric Hovind, affirms the ultimate authority of God's Word, the truth of creation, and why it matters to you.
What was Daniel like on January 19th, 2015? What was going on and what led you to send that message?
Oh, at that time, I was a passionate atheist, and I thought that Christianity was not a good thing. I thought that it was anti-science and that it was anti-human, that Christians were essentially a death cult. And I thought that a lot of atheists think that way because we want the end of the world to happen. So they think that we're a death cult. So I thought that Christianity just was not a good thing, and it was based on a lie. And I was passionately against it. I was more so against Islam because I recognized that Islam was worse. But I was tracking apologetics, Christian apologetics, and I loved to debate. I found you guys. I found your debates, and I found Sci 10 and some of the presuppositional apologetics. And you guys were the first people that I saw that were actually taking it to the atheists and closing their mouths. And I just could not believe it when I saw it. And I knew that there had to be some game, some ruse. I just knew it, but I couldn't really figure out exactly what it was. I couldn't really understand what was happening. It seemed like you were doing something to them, but if they tried to do it to you, you wouldn't let them. And it just seemed really underhanded. And so I was frustrated about it. And I thought I would message you. I didn't think I'd ever hear anything from you because you're a pretty busy man. But I figured, why not? And lo and behold, you actually did end up responding, if I remember right. So that's where I was at the time.
That's interesting. What is it that led you to atheism? Tell me that backstory. What made you go, you know what? I'm going to choose that God doesn't exist.
Well, I never really believed until I actually got saved. I always thought that Christianity was just not true. It never really rang true. I would ask my mom questions about her faith, and she would say, you just have to believe. And that really rubbed me the wrong way because I'm like, well, if I were born in a different country with a different religion, and I said, hey, why is this true? And I get told the same thing. Well, they can't both be true. So, this is one of those things where if you're a parent listening, you really need to know why you believe what you believe. You need to know and have a good answer for your children. It's very important because if they have a critical thinking mind, and even if they don't, others might, their friends might, when they start giving them these answers. I just didn't feel like I was getting good answers to my questions the vast majority of the time. Christianity is very counterintuitive to human thinking. The idea that Jesus, it was God, and that he came here, and that he went to a cross, and that he died for our sins, it's very strange. It doesn't really make sense to people that are not saved. It's a very strange idea. I did not get it until I got saved. When I understood it finally, even though I'd heard it 1,000 times, that's when I got saved. So it just didn't make any sense to me. And the world I looked at didn't seem like there was a God or anything magical. But the truth of the matter is that atheism is really about ego. And what I mean by that is people that are atheists get to say that they are the ultimate authority. And most of them aren't going to admit this, but it's the truth. If there's no God above you, you get to decide what's true. You get to decide what you believe in. You get to decide what's right or wrong. There's no one above you. So it's a way of making yourself God. And that's why the vast majority of atheists have such large egos. And I was no exception to that rule. I still have a large ego, but God's working on me. I hope.
I said he always does. He's still working on me, baby. No doubt about it.
There's a lot of work left to be done. But yeah, that was basically some of the thinking that led me to atheism was, and there are a lot of things in the Bible that are hard to believe. Like, Moses parting the Red Sea, a talking snake. These are not things that we see every day. These are things that none of us have really ever seen. I've never witnessed a miracle other than the miracle of God working in me and turning me into somebody else that I never thought I would be. But up until I got saved, I'd never seen a miracle, and most people haven't. So it's just a very difficult thing to believe. It's really a work of God, I think, honestly.
How much arguing did you do? And was it how much passion was there? How much time did you spend arguing online? How many hours over how many years? And was it mostly online or was it also in person? What was that? If we would have encountered you in person or online, what was that, Daniel, like?
So one of the things that I used to do, and I feel bad about this now, but I would hit someone with so many different points that it was essentially impossible for them to try to reply. And now atheists do it to me, and it bothers me. But I remember, I used to be the same way. And I'm like, gosh, I can't believe I did that. That's really low. I mean, it would be like pages. I was passionate,
So
like
literally
one
copy
response.
and paste? Had stuff ready to copy and paste?
No, I wasn't copying and pasting. I wrote it all out. I was serious. I mean, I don't know how much of my Twitter feed you've looked at and you see how I am now. I was that way then, but without any restrictions.
Oh, man. Well, I have enjoyed your Twitter feed here recently over the last couple of weeks, and your wife's. Wow, is she a bold proclaimer of truth? That's incredible. Just as passionate as you are now for Christianity, you were the same with atheism. Only no biblical restrictions on what you're allowed to say and what you're allowed to do as an atheist. How much time did you spend doing that?
Be as mean as you want.
Yeah,
a lot. Probably even more time than I spend now as a Christian because I have a family now. And at the time, I was married but didn't have any kids, and my marriage was very bad. So I had a lot of time because it was a very cold marriage that we weren't talking very much. And it was something that I was passionate about. I really thought that atheism was true. I really thought and believed that Christianity was a force for bad in the world. I did not understand it. I didn't think that there was anything good about it. And that's why when atheists talk to me about Christianity in the way that they do, I can relate because I was the same way. I think that they're totally wrong, but I remember thinking the same way that they did, and I get it. So, yes, I spent a lot of time arguing with Christians. I argued with my mom all the time, nonstop, whenever she would message to me. One time my grandma messaged me and she said something like, "God bless you," at the end of her message. And I sent her this big, long response about how I didn't believe in God. And I mean, it was ridiculous. I'm just embarrassed, but it is what it is. I was passionate about it. And it's funny because a lot of atheists, they don't think that I actually was an atheist. And, you're actually pulling these messages that I don't even have. You're finding them And so it's kind of corroboration for me, even though I did a Twitter call with my mom that's recorded where she was talking about how I used to be. But I didn't have these messages that you're reading. So it's funny to be hearing that again. But I was definitely an extremely passionate atheist, one of the most passionate, I would say. And I spent a lot of time on it.
I'll be happy to send you these. These are your emails that you wrote to me. Here's how you ended your email to me after. So I wrote back, asked you some questions. You responded to my questions and then asked me some questions and ended with this. I'd be surprised if you didn't already know that your argument is flawed and more of a bullying tactic to avoid evidence and facts and beat your opponents into submission. I see the way you argue, and it reminds me of how I argue when I know I'm wrong, but I don't want to admit it. I, too, am great at word games and misdirection, and I see similarities between us. My family constantly tells me I should have been a lawyer. Really, the main difference is that you were more indoctrinated than I was. I was able to get out of the cage and start thinking for myself, and it is truly liberating, I can assure you. You, however, are kind of stuck. Even if I were to single-handedly shatter your faith with this message, you have people depending on you. This is your livelihood, and you've built your entire reputation on this. If you're half as smart as I think you are, I'd bet that you don't actually believe any of this, but you're stuck. It's all you know how to do. If that's the case, then I'm sorry for you. I hope you do reply. I hope you'll take time to actually address these things I've said and asked. That's what led to a conversation. My assistant, Amanda, said, hey, why don't you just give Daniel a call? It's a long email, and I don't have a lot of time to do a long email response.
It was a long email, wasn't it? I don't even remember, but I bet it was a long email.
It was. Once she brought these emails up, I remember scheduling and I remember talking to you, but I don't remember specifically some of the details of that. But you, in our conversation, said you had some of those details. You remembered that conversation. What was that like?
Well, I wasn't expecting for there to be somebody else that was in the conversation with you and I. So that was interesting.
Landon Mosley was his name, or is his name.
Landon Mosley.
Great guy, loves apologetics, and so he and I are the ones that reached out to. Yeah, he was here in town at that time when our call was scheduled. I'm like, hey, Landy, I'm about to talk to an atheist. You want to join me? And so, yeah, it was Landon and I. Yeah, because he was over in Mobile. Okay.
I expected it to go better than it did. We'll put it that way. But it went all right. I remember vaguely that I asked some good questions that made you think or appeared to make you think. I thought you were really charitable. I thought it was a good conversation. And I was still perplexed afterwards. I didn't really fully understand the argument still. It wasn't until much, much later that I really understood what presuppositional apologetics is actually doing and what it's about. And it's something that very, very few atheists actually understand. But as far as your question goes, that was mainly what I remember. My memory isn't very good, though. So I remembered that I was really happy that you talked to me. I thought that was awesome that you took the time, and it made an impression that you did. And you actually talked to me at least twice. I think it was twice exactly, if I remember right. And now that I'm saved, I'm so thankful that you took the time to talk to me. And that's why I wanted to get back in touch with you, was to tell you how much it means to me now. Because I know that all the atheists that I talk to all the time, if any of them ever got saved, I would be ecstatic if they would tell me, just so I could rejoice with them. So I wanted to tell you.
And I got to tell you, I did rejoice. I was speaking when we got back in touch 7 years later, and 2015, 8 years later from our conversation. And it was such a joy to get to hear your heart and your passion for Jesus Christ today compared to where you were 7 years ago. Can you give me an overview of that journey from atheist Daniel to Christian Daniel, what that looked like?
Sure, I'll try and not make it too long. The big thing that really got me asking questions was the conversation that I listened to between Sam Harris and Ben Affleck, which I think you're familiar with. I don't know if you saw that at the time, but in the atheist world, it was a big deal. And it was a big deal to me because Sam Harris was saying something that I thought was very common sense. He said that, listen, we don't like Christians because they're conservative. Muslims are more conservative than Christians, so we should have an even bigger problem with them. And then Ben Affleck called him a racist and slandered him on national television. And I'm thinking, Islam is not even a race, Ben. And you're an atheist. You should know better. And Sam Harris is absolutely right. If we don't like conservatives, then we should be totally against Islam and Muslims because they're way more conservative than Christians are and way more passionate. They tend to be. So that conversation didn't make any sense. But what really didn't make sense was how many atheists sided with Ben Affleck. It was about half of the atheist community, and it caused a huge divide between the atheists that sided with Ben Affleck and the atheists that sided with Sam Harris. And the atheists that sided with Sam Harris, I think, ultimately ended up being the atheists that were the liberals, the true liberals. That's how we thought of ourselves. And then the atheists that sided with Ben Affleck were the communists, essentially, even though I didn't know that they were communists. But I knew that they were not espousing true liberalism like I was. Now, I think that communism and all that is really liberal, but that's a different story. We thought of ourselves as the true liberals, and we thought of them as people that had lost their minds, basically. And so I got really into arguing against Christianity still, but also trying to figure out where all this stuff was coming from, because it wasn't just Ben Affleck. It was feminism, talking about the wage gap and how women get paid less than men, even though when you actually mitigate for all of these other factors, you find that they get paid the same for the same job in the same work. And if a woman wasn't getting paid for the same work, she could sue. You know, it's just things like that that's just so easily debunked, but you hear it over and over again from these popular YouTube channels. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, where's all this stuff coming from? Because there was even this thing, I don't know if you remember, but it was called Atheism Plus. And that was atheism plus feminism. And I didn't want anything to do with that. I was thinking, well, women have the right to vote. They can do whatever they want. They can work. Why is feminism even still a thing? So even though I was an atheist, I still had some common sense, some God-given common sense, I think. And that's really what led me down a path, because there was just something I was always trying to itch and figure out, where is all this other stuff coming from? And I think the next really big thing that happened as far as all of that was, it must have been 2014. I was really big into CrossFit. And I was watching this Netflix documentary about the greatest CrossFitter that's probably ever lived, Rich Froning. Some people might see this and disagree with me, but I thought he was at the time the greatest CrossFitter that had ever lived. And I really looked up to him. I thought he was a man of great character. And I'm watching this documentary about him. And in the documentary, he's spending time with his family. He's working hard. And in all of his competitions, he would always help the people that were behind him cross the line. He was a true sportsman. He had great manners, just a man of integrity as far as I could tell. I really looked up to him. But I'm watching this documentary. He's spending time with his family. I just keep thinking, what a great guy. What a great guy. And then I see him sit down to pray with his family. And as soon as I saw him do that, I immediately dismissed him. I immediately pushed him out of my mind and said, oh, he's just another stupid Christian. But then I had an epiphany, and I thought, wait a second, who would I want to be deployed with me? If I were to be deployed, would I want one Rich Froning with me by my side? Or would I want 10,000 of the atheists that I know? all these guys that are so smart, but how many of them have any real character or moral fiber and would do the right thing if it might mean that their lives would be gone, right? And when I thought about it that way, I realized that I would take one Rich Froning over any number of the atheists that I knew. And I'm not saying that there aren't any atheists that aren't that way. There are atheists that have character and that would do the right thing. But all of the ones that I knew and talked to and dealt with didn't. I had no respect for them. And I had no real respect for myself other than my foolish pride. But the thing that they mostly talked about was women, drugs, pornography. Those were the things that they mostly talked about. And it was like crabs in a bucket too. It's everybody trying to one-up each other. That's what I love so much about Christianity. I know that there is some of that, but in my church and the Christians that I talk to, we lift each other up. We're not trying to tear each other down, but that's getting off topic here. So what I realized in that moment was that Rich Froning was a good guy, and that a lot of Christians actually were like Rich Froning. They were like the atheists, and it made me see Christians and Christianity in a completely different light ever since. It kind of made me see Christianity as maybe the good guys. And it might have actually happened after you and I talked. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly when I saw that. But it started to make me think that Christianity was not so bad. And I was starting to see other things too, like all the madness that I was talking about, like feminism and all the woke stuff. It wasn't being called woke at the time, but it is now. All of that nonsense and the transgender stuff was starting up. I mean, and now we have men beating women up. I mean, and it's just going to get worse. It's just going to keep getting worse and more absurd. And I was seeing all of that, and I knew that that wasn't being caused by Christianity. I knew that. I knew what was causing it was that we had moved into being a very secular country. I mean, what else would you blame it on? People were moving away from God, and they're moving towards something else, and you're getting all this depravity and madness and insanity. People don't even know what truth is anymore. They don't even care. People think you can't even know truth. I never believed that. People saying that right and wrong don't exist and that it's just opinion. That's madness. I'll get to that in a bit. But I started to see that Christianity was really a bulwark against all of the madness in our culture. And I think Ion Hercule has actually started to see that. I don't know if you're familiar with what she tweeted out just the other day, but she said something very similar, that atheism has no answers to the big questions that we ask, and that there's so much madness in our society, and atheism has no answers to it. And she's now saying that she's a Christian. Now, I'm not sure that she understands the gospel yet, but she's moving the same direction I was, 100%. So I think the next thing after that happened that really changed how I thought about all of this was I talked to my cousin Matt, and I was talking about these things with him, and I was saying how Christianity was not really bad. I didn't really think that it was bad, and I was telling him about all these things from liberalism that were just crazy to me, and I didn't understand. I still had no idea where it was coming from. And he said, listen, I've got a book that you need to read. Read this book and you'll understand. And he told me the book, and it was called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And so I read the book, and it absolutely explained so much of what I had been wanting to understand, but it didn't actually explain where everything was coming from ultimately. But what the book said, which even further made me side with Christians and think of Christians as the good guys, even though I didn't think what they believed was true. What the book said was that liberals are operating on two moral foundations, which is fairness and equality and do no harm, essentially, something along those lines. It's been a while since I read the book. But they have two pillars, whereas a conservative has those same two pillars, but they also have three additional pillars. I think one is tradition, one is the idea of the sacred, and I can never remember what the last one is. But that's why if you talk to a liberal and you say, hey, if a brother and sister can't have babies, is it okay if they have sex? Well, a liberal is going to say, yeah, it is. And why will they say that? Because they're just going beep, bop, boop. I have two pillars. Is it fair and equal? Yes, it is. Is there any harm done? Well, they can't have a baby, so can't be any harm. So therefore, beep, bop, boop, it's good, right? That's how we think. That's how human beings think. We factor and everything through our presuppositions, our moral pillars, and then we come to the conclusion, right? Whenever you think, is something right or wrong, you're running your head through scripture. What did Jesus say? Beep, bop, boop, right? And that's how we think now. But that's why they give a very different answer than a conservative, because a conservative has more than those two pillars. A conservative also has the idea of the sacred. And also taboos are a big part of one of those pillars that the liberals just do not have. So that taboo thing is going to be like, no, that's totally wrong. Brother and sister should not make love. And when I read that, I realized, wow, so liberals really are not working with a very good moral foundation. They're working with a very shallow foundation. And for anybody listening to this that's not a Christian, this book is written by a liberal. Jonathan Haidt is not a conservative. He's a liberal who studied this, and this is what he found. So, if anything, this book is biased towards liberals. It's written by a liberal, but it definitely made me want to be a conservative. We'll put it that way. And so, I think after that, if not even before, I thought of myself very much as a conservative, but still an atheist. I think I'm a lot like, or I was a lot like Silverman is, David Silverman is now, because apparently he's quite a conservative, even though he's still an atheist.
Really?
And I know
I
you
have
debated
followed
him.
him the last. I did, yeah, I have. I have not been able to follow him ever since he left the American Atheist. I haven't really kept up with him.
I think a lot has changed with him. I actually messaged him on Twitter today, and he messaged me back. I said he was saying how, I mean, we're off topic real quick, but I'll just tell you. He was complaining about the madness and everything, because he's a conservative like I was. And I said, why don't you come over here to Christianity? We'd love to have you. I said, Ion Hersey is talking about the same stuff. And he replied back and he said, oh, I don't think Ion Hersey is saved, unfortunately. Well, he didn't say unfortunately. I'm adding that part. But, I think he is a lot closer than a lot of other atheists that are still. Once you realize that conservatism is the correct way to be, and that once you erode that, you're just going to not have a civilization for very long, it leads to other thoughts. Like, where did these conservative values come from? So
you went there. Your mind was like, okay, well, how do these conservative values even exist? You wondered that.
Well, eventually I did. I think that's pretty much the next part of the story, because I didn't really think about it at that time. I just thought that there was clearly a right and a wrong. And I think the next part of the story is where I went into a Discord chat. I was just walking my dog at a park and I was bored, so I went into a Discord chat. And for anybody that doesn't know what Discord is that's listening to this, it's just an app on your phone or on your computer that you can go in and you can talk to people through direct messaging, or you can go into chat rooms where a bunch of people can all talk at the same time, and there's moderators and they can mute you or whatnot. So I went into one of these big rooms with a bunch of people, and they hadn't seen me in there before. It was my first time. Then they started asking me questions, and I told them that I was an atheist, and they asked me something about morality, and I said, something along the lines that tipped them off to the fact that I believed in right and wrong. And they told me that they were atheists. So I thought, okay, great, no problem, we're all going to agree. But when they found out that I believed that morality was objective, they went in on me. They're like, wait, you're an atheist and you believe that morality is objective? An atheist cannot, I just have to say, atheists cannot believe that this happened because they don't understand this stuff. But these atheists actually had some grasp of the moral argument. Probably not all of it, but they understood enough to know that it's insanely difficult to ground objective morality within atheism, without a God. I think it's impossible. And that's what they told me. Like, you can't really make sense of that if there's no God. And I'm thinking, of course I can. Like, rape is wrong, murder is wrong. And they're like, you really can't. You don't know what you're talking about. And they told me about Hume's guillotine. And Hume's guillotine basically says you cannot derive an ought from an is. And what that means is that just because something is the case, like we don't like pain, or we have evolved to be social species, or whatever, just because something is the case doesn't mean it ought to be the case. You cannot derive an ought from an is. So an example of that would be, just because my house is green doesn't mean my house ought to be green. The fact that my house is green tells you nothing about what color my house should be, or if my house should be any color. It doesn't tell you that. All I've told you is just my house is green. So you cannot derive an ought from an is. And atheists make this mistake all the time. Hume pointed this out, and he was an atheist, so he actually understood these things. He was the first one to really point this out, though. He said, we keep saying something is the case, therefore we should. And that doesn't make sense. Just because something is the case doesn't mean that we should do something. There's no ought there. Just because something is the case doesn't mean we have an obligation. The obligation would have to come from something else. It can't come from the fact that something is the case. So they explained this to me, and I determined in my mind that I was going to prove them wrong because what they were saying was nonsense. Of course, it's wrong to rape. Of course, it's wrong to murder. There are moral facts. I've always believed that. To me, the idea of saying, well, I don't like rape, I don't like murder, but that's just my personal preference. If you want to go rape and you want to go murder, hey, that's your preference. Why are they? You're not wrong. You're not wrong. You have your opinion. I have my opinion. If morality is not objective, then someone who wants to rape is the same as somebody who wants to eat pizza without pineapple. I love pineapple on my pizza. I don't know about you. Maybe we'll never talk again because I said that.
Yeah, I was just saying, man, that's tough right there. But we'll
You're one
keep
of those,
going.
huh?
Yeah, well, pineapple upsets my stomach, so that's
okay. Well, that's fair. That's fair.
Before,
but it's delicious.
Before that, I did do the ham and pineapple pizza.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all just a preference. If there's no fact about the matter, if there are no moral facts, then it's just preference. I don't like pineapple on my pizza. You do. You do you. I'm going to eat my pizza the way I want. You eat the pizza the way you want. I'm not going to go try and stop you from eating pizza the way that you want. You can eat it however you want to eat it. I don't have a say. There's no standard above both of us that tells us how to eat a pizza. And if there's no objective morality, then there's no standard above us telling us how we're supposed to treat each other. Me saying, well, I think we should love each other and I think we should have empathy is just as valid and just as arbitrary as somebody that says, I think I want to be king of the world and do whatever I want to people. There's nothing different about those two positions. Different strokes for different folks. It's that simple. And that's madness. That is nonsense. I've never believed that. And that's what that leads to if morality is not objective. And so I set out to prove them wrong, to prove that you can ground objective moral values and duties without God. And I tried for something like 2 to 4 years to do it. And once I understood how difficult the problem is, I eventually just gave up. But But when I gave up, I still didn't believe that morality was subjective. I just knew that you couldn't do it without God, basically. I knew that trying to ground it without God was impossible, but I wasn't prepared to bite the bullet and say, okay, well, different strokes for different folks. I guess there's nothing wrong with raping. I guess there's nothing wrong with genocide. I wasn't prepared to say that. That's still absolute nonsense. And because that was such nonsense to me, and because I couldn't justify that belief within atheism, it made me start looking at atheism more critically. And this is something, if there are any atheists listening to this, probably not going to listen to me, but I'm going to say it anyway. You have a very critical eye of religion, but do you ever turn that eye on the consequences and the ramifications of atheism? And I know what you're going to say, atheist, if you're listening to this. You're going to say, well, atheism doesn't mean anything. It just means one thing about one thing. It just means we lack a belief in God. No, it doesn't. It affects everything. The question of whether or not God exists affects everything down the line. And that's what you need to understand, atheist that's watching. It affects everything metaphysically down the line, because it's the most important question that we can ask. Is there meaning? Are we here for a reason? Is there teleology? Is there a design? There is no bigger question than, does God exist? That's it. And the way you answer that is going to affect everything else, all of it. So just saying, well, it's just one answer to one question, it's the most important question, and it affects everything else. So no, it's not just one answer to just one question. It affects your entire worldview. And there are going to be philosophical consequences when your answer to that question is wrong. And your answer to that question is wrong. And that's what I want you to understand. You need to turn your eye, your critical eye, on atheism and say, if there is no God, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that I have meaning? Does that mean that morality exists? Does that mean that I am the same person I was 2 minutes ago? And spoiler alert, no. You are not the same person that you were 2 minutes ago. Identity over time is nonsense if there is no God. Everything is changing. Everything is in flux. Morality doesn't exist. It doesn't make any sense. Everything becomes absurd.
It is awesome to watch a former atheist be that passionate to atheists. I just got to tell you, it's just really cool because you were there and you're right. They don't have answers and they can't, these things are incredibly important. This is really cool to watch. This is really cool to watch. Okay, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I started to probe atheism and the worldview that arises from it. And I started to seriously think about the things that I hadn't thought about before. And one of those things was epistemology. So a lot of atheists are familiar with this word, but some people listening may not be, so I'll explain it really quickly. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Like, do I actually know that my wife is getting upset with me for taking so long out here, right? How do I know that? I'm kidding. She's fine. But how do I know that there's coffee in this mug still, right? That's what epistemology is about. How do we know what we know? And my justification for not believing in God had to do with epistemology, because I was saying, listen, I don't believe in God because I'm an empiricist. Empiricism is a type of epistemology. Empiricism says, I know something is true if I have seen it demonstrated in front of me. Now, they make exceptions for this all over the place. But that's what they say, okay? That's what they say. So if you show me that there's coffee in my cup, okay, I'll believe it. But until you show me that there's coffee in this cup and I taste the coffee, I don't believe it. So everything has to be seen, tasted, felt, something. It's got to be sensed. It's all about sense data, okay? Heard, felt, whatever. All of your senses. That's what empiricism is about. It has to be, all knowledge comes through the senses. So that's basically the theory. And so I was saying, well, listen, I've never seen any evidence for God. I've never seen God. I've never seen a miracle. You show me God. You show me Santa Claus going down a roof or whatever. I'll believe in Santa Claus. You show me God. If God shows up in the clouds, I'll believe that God exists. But right now, I haven't seen any evidence, empirical evidence, that God exists. And until I do, I'm not going to believe in God. And I started to think about that. And I was critical about it. And I realized one day, I don't know how, I mean, obviously it must have been God. But I realized one day, wait a second. I'm here telling people that unless they can believe, unless they can show me something that's real, unless they can show it to me, I'm not going to believe in it. And I'm saying that that's logical. I'm making a logical argument, right? Well, have you ever held logic in your hand? Because I'm appealing to it, you know, and you and I probably talked about this, and it probably went right over my head, but it started to come into my mind. I started to just kind of realize this stuff. You know, I've never held logic. I've never tasted logic. I don't believe that logic is made of atom. Have you ever seen a logic atom? I haven't. What would that even look like? So I didn't believe that logic was made of material, but I'm appealing to it every time I make an argument. So how can I appeal to something as if it exists? So I'm saying it exists because I'm appealing to it, but I'm calling myself a materialist. And a materialist believes that everything is made of atoms and it's all matter and energy. But I didn't believe that logic was matter and energy. So here I am realizing that I'm believing in something, logic, the laws of logic that are immaterial, you know, and I had no evidence for them. Okay. And I couldn't square that. I couldn't justify that. And I think I think there were a few other things I realized as well that are also not made of matter, like numbers, for example, like the number 2. Have you ever seen a number 2 in reality? Now, some people are going to, you know, draw a number 2 and be like, here it is, dummy. But that's not an actual 2. That's a representation of a 2. That's like me drawing a donkey and saying this is a donkey. That's not a real donkey. That's just a symbol of a donkey, right? So nobody's actually seen a real 2 because 2s are metaphysical in nature, meaning that they are not material. They are immaterial. And so I realized that there are at least a couple of things. Now, I'll tell you that there are way more than this. But at the time, I realized that there were just a few of these things that I believed in. Obviously, I believed in numbers and I believed in logic that I couldn't account for within my epistemology. And so I talked to an atheist friend of mine. This is another part of the story where atheists are going to say that I am just making things up. But the story is what the story is, and I'll never forget it. So I talked to him. He was the friend on Discord. And I told him what was going on because he was about 45 and he knew a lot of philosophy and he was an atheist. And we used to rag on Christians all the time. So I went to him kind of as my mentor and I said, listen, why are we acting like logic exists if we don't have any empirical evidence that logic exists? Why are we calling ourselves materialists if we believe in immaterial things like logic? Am I missing something here? And he said, and I'll never forget this. He said, if you keep asking questions like this, you will not be an atheist for much longer. Wow. That's what he said. Which really upset me, by the way, because I did not want to believe that God existed still. I liked Christianity, but I still thought that atheism was the truth. So I was trying to rationalize all of this. I wanted him to make it make sense. And I thought that he would do that. That's why I went to him. So when he said this, I got upset. And I think rightfully so. But I definitely wasn't going to stop asking the questions. Because even though I was an atheist and I was super full of myself, I was never not concerned with what was actually the truth. I always cared about what's true. And I didn't really realize, of course, at the time that the truth isn't a thing, it's a person. But we're moving ahead. So after I talked to him about that, I just kept diving deeper and deeper into these problems. And I think the next really big one, which is probably the biggest, and I know you're familiar with this, the biggest one that really sealed the deal was the problem of knowledge. Once again, knowledge is something that is immaterial. You can't prove that it exists. It's totally unscientific to believe in it. But I was just thinking, I'm talking about epistemology. I have this theory of knowledge. But how is it possible for me to actually know anything? Because I'm starting to understand that there are presuppositions that we're just assuming that we can't really make sense of, that aren't justified. And if that's all we have, then we can't actually know anything. Now, I'm going to unpack that a little bit for the people that don't know what I'm talking about. So, in order to know something, knowledge means a justified true belief. That's the traditional wording of it. So, you have to believe it in order to know it. It's got to be true. And you have to have a justification, a good justification, in order for it to be knowledge. Now, that justification part is really critical to all this. Because if you believe, if you're standing at a roulette table, for example, and the ball lands on green, like a green, snake eyes, I guess, is green. So that's a 0, 00 or whatever. So it lands on 00. And you form a belief that if you put your arms behind your back like this and you close your eyes on the next go around, it's going to land on 00 again. Okay? So that's your belief. And then it happens. Okay? So you had a belief that turned out to be true, but was it justified? No, that's not a justified belief. So it needs to be justified. You need to actually have a good reason for the belief. All right? And when you start to understand that, you start to understand the problem, because in order for a belief to be justified, it can't be based on assumptions. Now, that is huge. If you're basing your belief on unjustified assumptions, then anything you base your belief on top of that unjustified assumption is unjustified. Okay? So what are these unjustified assumptions? Well, there's a lot that we are all working with in order to try and make sense of the world. So one of them is that our perception of the world is sound or valid, so that we can trust our senses. That is a complete and total assumption that we have absolutely no justification for. Because, and this is just something that atheists just cannot understand for the life of them, even though I explain it to them over and over again. But when you say, well, yeah, this coffee mug is real because I'm holding it in my hand, and I say, how do you know that? You're assuming that your senses are valid. You're assuming that your senses are giving you correct information about the outside world, but how do you know that they are? What do they say? Well, I know because I'm holding it in my hand. That's called begging the question, okay? Because you just used your senses in order to validate your senses. So the very thing that is in question, are your senses valid? Are they working correctly? You just used those in order to say that your senses were working. Now, atheists understand this perfectly when Christians do this with the Bible. If a Christian says, well, the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true, the atheist says, hey, you can't do that. That's circular reasoning. But when you point out that they're doing that when they're appealing to their senses in order to justify their senses, suddenly they don't understand what circular reasoning is. It's just a complete, goes right over their head, and they just cannot understand it. I mean, there are some that do understand these issues, but the vast majority do not understand these issues because these are incredibly devastating to their whole system. So it's just like cognitive dissonance to the max. So that's one total assumption. We have no justification whatsoever for saying that our senses are valid. Because in order to justify that belief, we have to appeal to our senses, the very thing in question. Now, another one, I'll do a couple more. Another one is that our reasoning is sound. How do you know you're not crazy? Well, in order to know if you're crazy or not, guess what you have to use? Your reasoning, your brain. So you say, well, I'm not crazy because X, Y, and Z. Well, guess what you just did? You just used the very thing in question to justify the thing that's in question. If you're crazy and you think that you have a bunch of great reasons for why you're not crazy, guess what? Those reasons aren't good, and you're crazy and you don't know it because you're crazy. So you can't use your brain in order to justify your brain. You cannot use your reasoning in order to justify that your reasoning is sound. But we need our reasoning to be sound in order to make sense of the world. And in order to have knowledge, we need to believe that our senses are working correctly in order to make sense of the world. So we have to believe these things, but there's absolutely no justification for it because it's just completely circular. There's many, many more of these that I could get into, but I'll just say that in order to have knowledge, the things that we need to have knowledge are all total assumptions. They're axiomatic. And when that is the case, that means that you can't know anything because all the things that you think you know are built on these assumptions that are totally unjustified. And if there's no justification ultimately at the bottom, then you don't have any justification for anything that you've built on top of it. So you can't have any knowledge. That's the first problem. The second problem is that even if somebody solves all these problems, which is never going to happen, even if somebody did solve all these problems, and we could, let's say, have knowledge, we could know something. Let's say I asked you, like, how much do you know for sure? And you said, well, I know 1% of everything that could possibly know. So imagine we draw a big circle, right? And in that circle is everything that you could possibly know about reality. And I say, how much do you know that's in that circle? You say 1%. Now, obviously it's not 1%, but we're being really generous. 1%. Well, can the things that are in that circle that you don't know prove you wrong about the things in that circle that you think you know? And the answer is yes, 100% they can. And what does that mean? What it means is that the only way to know anything is to know everything. You can't know anything unless you know everything, because if you don't know everything, then the little things that you think you know can be proven wrong by all the things that you don't know. And that's just obvious if anybody's being honest with themselves. So you have two massive problems that you have to get around if you're going to try to have a worldview that can even account for the possibility of having knowledge. And atheism is just completely flailing at this. And that's what I started to realize. And I think, what that actually means, though, is that atheism cannot be true. And what I mean by that is, if atheism cannot account for knowledge, which it can't, the only way to have knowledge is for an all-knowing being to exist. That's the only way. Because unless there's a being that knows everything, no one can know anything because of the reason that I just went over. So atheism, if atheism is true, then that means that there is no such being that knows everything. And that means that knowledge itself is impossible. Knowledge is impossible. We can't know anything. But guess what? That's a contradiction. When you say, I know nothing, that is a contradiction. That's like saying the truth is that there is no truth. I'm going to try and unpack this a little bit for the listener, but every claim that is about every claim that is about falsehood is also a claim about truth. Okay, so when you say that is false, this thing over here is false, you're saying it is true that that thing over there is false. Every time you say something is false, you're implying that truth actually exists and it's real. Every false statement or everything you say is false is also a true statement. It's a truth statement. And in the same way, every statement about ignorance is also a statement about knowledge. So when you say that is false, you're saying it's true that that's false. And when you're saying I don't know, you're saying I know that I don't know. It's a statement of knowledge to make a statement of ignorance. Okay? So when you say I can't know anything, that is a contradiction. That is like saying there is no truth. It's a contradiction. So if the atheist worldview is true, then that means that no God exists. And if that is true, then we can't know anything. But if we can't know anything, then that's a contradiction. Therefore, atheism cannot be true. And if atheism is not true, because it leads to this obvious contradiction, then there must be at least one God in existence who's an all-knowing being. It's literally that simple. And I've written all this out, by the way, for any atheist that wants to go through it. But atheism leads to absurdity and contradiction. And so if atheism is contradictory, which it is, then it can't be true. It cannot be true that there is no God. There must be one God at least who is all-knowing. And so once I realized that, I'm like, well, what do I do? I mean, my worldview is just not true. There is God, you know? And I talked to my mom about this, and she was really excited because she had been praying for me.
Wow.
Every night. And I told her, listen, Mom, I know that God exists, and I'm going to give my life to him, but I'm not ready yet. And she said, Daniel, why don't you just do it right now? Do it tonight. And I said, no, I don't want to do it tonight. I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it when I'm ready. But I am going to do it. And she was frustrated, but also excited. I mean, thank God I didn't get hit by a bus or something, right?
Yeah.
But I waited for 3 months. I waited for 3 months before I finally, got down on my knees. And the reason why I waited, I didn't know this at the time. I think I knew it subconsciously. But the reason why I waited was because I wanted to keep sinning. I wanted to keep being my own boss. I didn't want to surrender. When you give your life to God, you are, in a way, committing suicide. Jesus said that. He said the old man dies. Okay, it's the serious thing. And we all know that deep down, how serious it is. I mean, it's a rebirth. When you do that, when you're serious about it, the person that you were is no more. So it's not something that people do lightly, and it's not something that I did lightly. And I waited 3 months, but finally I got down on my knees, and I remember just praying. It was really weird to pray, by the way, the first time. I think a lot of atheists will be able to relate to this. Normally when people pray, you're like kind of like looking around, like, should I close my eyes? Like, this is weird. You just want it to be over, uncomfortable. So that was like the only time I really prayed before that. But I finally got down on my knees and I prayed. I said, God, listen, I know that you're real. I know that you exist. And because I know that, I want to serve you. That's all I want. I want to give you my life and serve you because I cared about morality. I cared about right and wrong. And I knew that if God existed, course he's good. Who else would be? Wasn't me, that's for sure. So I believed that there was such a thing as right and wrong, and good and evil, and God can't be evil, because evil is deprivation. It's a perversion of good. So good has to be the real thing, and evil is the shadow of good. In the same way, my hand has a shadow. The real thing is the hand, and evil is the shadow of goodness. And where does that goodness come from? Well, it's not just something floating out in space. It's tied to something. It's grounded in something. It's not grounded in any of us, that's for sure. We're all terrible. But it's grounded in God, obviously. So God is good. And why wouldn't you want to be on the side of the good guy? Especially when you care about morality, especially when you think that there's something wrong with rape and murder and these types of things, which I did. So, yeah, I just realized that God had to be good. That's what I said to him. I said, I know that you're good, and because you're good, I want to serve you. And I don't know what that means, but I want to give you my life. And I just want to serve you. And at this time, I still didn't really know what God it was. I thought it was probably the God of Christianity, but I really wasn't sure. I just knew that God existed, and I wanted to be on his side. And I got up from that prayer. And I know some Christians are going to be like, well, where's the gospel in this? This is just the way that things happened. So the gospel does come in, obviously, but I'm not going to tell the story in a way that it didn't happen. And I got up from that prayer, and I remember I was walking. It was nighttime, and I was walking to go get food. And I was just looking up at the stars, and I was thinking, wow, God is real. Like, I'm here for a reason. I have a purpose. I'm not just some stupid stardust floating through space. When I die, I'm not just going to be nothing for the rest of time. I used to think about death, and a cold shiver would go down my spine, and I would break out in a cold sweat when I was an atheist. It was terrifying to think about. I think a lot of atheists can relate to that. They kind of just push it down and just don't think about it. But the idea of not existing for the rest of time is terrifying. And atheists will say, well, I don't want to exist for the rest of time. They're lying. They're lying. I think that they're lying. I know I did. But I was just walking to go get food, and it was just so profound to realize that the world is actually a magical place. That there is a being who is watching out for us and who loves us and who made us for a reason. And that is so incredible to realize. And I lose sight of that sometimes, but it's really, really incredible to think that actually is the truth, and that we're not just a bunch of evolved pond scum here for no reason, and just floating through space, and eventually the earth is going to get swallowed by the sun. That is a terrible worldview. It's just so depressing, really. But yeah, I was just walking to chow and realizing that. And I guess the next part is just when I heard the gospel, actually, for the first real time. I'd heard it my whole life. I had heard that Jesus died for your sins. Jesus died for your sins. But it never made sense to me. Why did Jesus die for my sins? What does that even mean? How does that work? It doesn't make sense until you actually listen with ears on. And I finally heard it, and suddenly it all clicked. It was about 2 weeks after this, I think I was watching a video or something. I don't remember it. It wasn't somebody telling me to my face, but I was listening to a video, I think, about it, and they were explaining what Christianity is about and how the gospel works. And suddenly, just the light bulb just completely turned on. And I just realized, wow, that is what Christianity is actually about. That is what happened. Jesus Christ came to earth as God, but also as a man, lived as a man for 33 years, and then voluntarily went to a cross and suffered one of the worst deaths that you can imagine. And he did that because he loved us and because he needed to fulfill his perfect justice, but he also wanted to be merciful. And he just wants to have a relationship with us, even though we don't deserve it. You know, when you realize that God is good and you're not, and that you're just a filthy, rotten, degenerate sinner, and yet he went to that cross for you and for me anyway, to die there just out of love. I mean, just think about it. The greatest being that can possibly exist made himself into a man. I mean, how humble, I'm getting tingles just thinking about it, honestly. But when I finally understood what he did and why he did it, I was a Christian after that. And I knew that I was. And I've been a Christian ever since. You know, and I also want to say, while I'm thinking about this, that when I got down on my knees and I prayed to God, I didn't expect him to really make changes in my life because I still had a huge ego. I just wanted to be on the side of the good guy, really. That's what I wanted to do. But I knew I needed to give him my life because he was sovereign. He was God. So I meant it, but I didn't really think of myself at the time as like a bad person. I still thought that I was good. This is how a lot of atheists think. They don't think that there's anything wrong with them. They think that whatever is wrong is somebody else's fault, but they're good. So that's kind of how I thought. And suddenly, the way that I was started to not be okay. The way that I talked, all the words that I would use, the curse words. Suddenly I started to get convicted about it out of nowhere. And it's not because I was even reading the Bible at this time, but I just would hear people talking and they would be throwing out F-bombs and, you know, this and that. And I would think, what? Do they really need to be talking like that? It actually sounds awful when they use all of that profanity. And then I would think, well, why am I using a bunch of profanity? You know, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't sound nice. It sounds terrible. Why am I talking like this? You know, people would use the Lord's name in vain. You know, they'd hit their hand or whatever and shout, you know, what they would say. And I think, why did they have to say Jesus' name right there? Why are they saying the Lord's name as an expletive? And I realized I did that. And I wanted to stop. I started to get convicted about these things. And suddenly I would be watching a movie that I loved, because I used to love movies. I almost never watch movies now, but I used to absolutely love Hollywood and all of that. I would watch the Oscars. I was obsessed. A lot of atheists are obsessed with pop culture. And I was no different. And I'd be watching a movie and there'd be a sex scene. And I would think, why did they need to put a sex scene in this? You know, like, what was the point? That didn't add anything to the story. Why did I need to watch that? You know, but before, it didn't bother me at all. I liked that kind of thing. I was like, yeah, this is great. But suddenly, I'm different. Suddenly, it isn't great. Suddenly, it annoys me. Suddenly, I'm skipping past the scene and I don't even want to watch the movie anymore. So God just started making all these changes in me. It wasn't overnight. It was bit by bit. But I just started to get convicted about things. And, you know, obviously God is still making changes, but the biggest change that is really the largest miracle to me was that he took away my porn addiction. This is something that I know so many men struggle with. Pornography is just totally evil, and I was completely addicted. I mean, we have these phones in our pockets, and, I can go and look at whatever I want in 2 seconds. And it's like kryptonite for men. It really is. And I was trying to stop, once I got saved and everything. I was trying to stop it. I was feeling convicted about it. And sometimes I would go like 2 weeks. And then something would just come over me. It was like I was possessed or something. But I couldn't control myself. I just had to go and do it. It's like I didn't have any control. And I prayed about it. And eventually I talked to my wife about it. And I said, listen, I have this problem. And I don't want to do this anymore. And what I want you to ask me if I've done it, like every day or a couple times a week. Because I'm not going to want to be honest with you, but I'm not going to lie to you either because I love you. And she agreed to do that. And ever since that conversation, I've never looked at it, not one time. I have never had the urge to go and do it. I've never done any of that kind of stuff ever since then. And we've had 2 children since. And there have been times, because she's had these children, where I couldn't touch her for a couple of months. And no problem. That is a miracle. That is a miracle. People say like God isn't real, and God is real. He performs miracles on people. You just have to surrender. You have to let him work. He can't do anything if you're not going to let him. But if you let him and you're surrendered to him truly, he will show you who he is, and he will change you, and you'll know that he's real. So I wanted to say that before I forgot, because I know it's something that a lot of men really struggle with. And it's just something that I'm so unbelievably thankful to God for releasing me from that, because that industry is totally evil and it destroys men, and it was destroying me, and I didn't even know it. So
tell me about the Daniel of today.
Well, the Daniel of today, I mean, I have a family. Like I said, I've got 2 beautiful children. We have a wonderful, wonderful church. We go to an independent fundamentalist Baptist church. My pastor is a tremendous man of God who I truly 100% respect, and I don't respect men very often. It's very rare that I respect a man. Very, very rare, actually. But my pastor is one of those men that I respect most in this life so far, and just a true man of God. And so we have this wonderful, amazing little church that just feeds us and gives us the word. And, I'm a father, and I'm trying my best to be a good father and to show my children that I love them and show them the love of Christ, and trying to show my wife the love of Christ. And we have a wonderful relationship most of the time when I'm not, messing things up.
Amen. You and me both.
Yeah. I'm not perfect. Like none of us are. Even Paul, who, other than Jesus Christ, is probably the greatest spokesman for Christianity that has ever lived, said, God, please deliver me from this body of death. We still war against the flesh every day. I still war against the flesh every day. I mean, I was a total depraved idiot before God messed with me, and I'm still an idiot, and I still have this dirty, rotten flesh on me. And, sometimes I wonder, why, God, why did you help me to get saved, And it frustrates me, honestly, because I know that there are so many other people out there that aren't saved, and I was so much meaner and worse than they are. And I'm like, God, what about them? What if I can get saved? Why aren't they already saved? It bothers me. It really bothers me. But I just have to remember that It's God's plan, and he's good, and he's got reasons for what he does, and I just need to trust him. But I want everyone to go to heaven. None of us deserve it, but Jesus died for all of us. I believe that 100%, that he died for every single last one of us. And, one of the things that people don't think about consciously, but we all know deep down, is that it's so difficult, I think, for us to forgive ourselves. That's why it's so difficult to accept the forgiveness of God, because in order to do that, you have to forgive yourself. And a lot of people, things that they've done, they don't think that they deserve forgiveness. And you don't. We don't deserve forgiveness, but God offers it to us freely. And I just want to say, if that's you and you're listening to this, yeah, you don't deserve forgiveness, but God didn't deserve to go to a cross either. And he went there and paid the price for you because he loves you.
Man. So from atheist to evangelist.
Well, that's high praise. I don't know. I'm doing what I can in my own limited way. I would love to be a professional apologist. I would love to be a good evangelist. I can't be a pastor because I've been married before. And my pastor says that I can't. And plus, I'd be a terrible pastor anyway. I mean, I don't care enough about people still. I care way more about people than I used to. But you really have to care about people in order to be a pastor. To me, caring about people and being there for people is so much more important than preaching a good sermon on Sunday if you're going to be a pastor. And I wouldn't be any good at that. I know God didn't have that in mind for me when he made me. So I'll never be a pastor, but I hope that someday I can, be a good evangelist, and I can help somebody to find Jesus Christ, and have just a little bit of a part to play in that. If that happens even just one time, I'll be ecstatic. That's why I called you, because I've been fighting this fight for the last 3 to 5 years, and I know what it's like. And it would just be so amazing for somebody to find me and say, hey, I got saved and I wanted to tell you, I did this, I said this to you and whatnot, but we talked and I just wanted to tell you that I got saved, and it meant something to me. That's why I wanted to talk to you, was to tell you that.
Well, you are actively tearing down arguments that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God publicly, online, through Twitter. You are actively sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. So, yeah, I go, God does it. The results are up to God. Our job is obedience. So to just see atheist that is condemning people of God to becoming a child of God and now evangelizing the world and doing exactly what God called you to do, to fulfill the Great Commission, what he calls all of us to do. I think is just a beautiful story. And then the fact that you can articulate truth and articulate these realities in an incredibly well put way, an incredibly convincing way, I think is just beautiful. So I'm excited about where God has brought you and whatever else God wants to do with you. I'm really excited about that, Daniel. I just think that's really, really cool. Really, really cool.
I'm excited to do anything that God wants me to do. Unless he wants me to go somewhere I don't want to go. I say that trepidatiously because, I actually made a meme about this kind of recently where, it's about things, me making plans and then, God is just laughing about our plans, and it's that Leonardo DiCaprio meme where he's like, or whatever. That's how I feel. But, it's hard to put all of your trust and faith in God. Especially for me, still. It's still a struggle. I think it's something that everybody struggles with, you know. Even though I've been given ample evidence and proof, you know, if I knew that God wanted me to pack up and go to Africa tomorrow, I don't know if I would. That's the honest truth. I hope I would. But it's not easy to just do whatever God wants. I just hope that if he does want me to do something like that, whatever he wants me to do, I do it, and I do it well. I probably won't, though, because of who I am, you know? But
thank God for his grace.
Yeah, thank God for his grace. Yeah. You know,
tell me about, you now run a Twitter account called Darwin to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
How long have you been doing that? What has that been like for you? To just give me a few minutes of story. I know we've gone long. Give me a few minutes of stories of that, and then.
Well, I really enjoy that a lot. I have a lot of fun there. I started making memes, and I don't see a lot of good Christian memes. So it's something that I really like to do. And so I started making memes that Christians can use and that will make Christians laugh. And, you know, I'm also putting out arguments. I wrote out the moral argument, which took me a long time, but I wanted to explain all of this in great detail for people. And, you know, mostly I am just making memes and posting those, and then responding to atheists and having conversations with atheists. And, you know, it's kind of funny because when I first started, atheists had so much hate for me. I mean, it was just hate. But now some atheists are actually warming up to me. You know, when you make somebody laugh, if you do a meme well and it's funny, even atheists can appreciate that, some of them.
Yeah.
You know, and as soon as you have somebody laughing, I mean, it's hard to hate somebody that you laugh with and that makes you laugh. So I've been sensing a shift. You know, my idea is eventually there will be more atheists that support Darwin to Jesus than are against, you know.
That's awesome. That's, you know, awesome.
Who knows? I'm kind of kidding around, but there has been a shift lately. But mostly, you know, I just have a lot of fun there talking to atheists, and you know, some atheists I have to be very hard on. I have to be very stern with because they have these really big egos, and I have to just slam them down, you know, a few pegs. And some block me for it, but some don't. Some like the challenge and they want to come back for more. And so they come back for more, and I give them some more. You know, and eventually there will be a begrudging respect maybe between them and I. And maybe we'll start talking. And it's happened. It happens. And maybe someday they'll ask me, do you really believe this stuff? And I'll say, yeah, I really do. And they'll say, why? And I'll tell them, you know, you just never know. Everybody is at a different place in their journey. And I'm there, I'm memeing, I'm making the arguments, and people can always DM me and talk to me about what I think and ask me for answers, and I'll do my best to give those answers. But I try not to be too pushy about these types of things. Everybody knows where I stand, and people know what the gospel is. You know, it's just a matter of, do they have ears to hear or not? So I have a lot of fun on Twitter, though. It's not for everybody. I'll say that. It's not for everybody what I do. Most Christians, they get upset because I hear a lot of blasphemy. I hear a lot of insults that come my way. And I'm kind of like the Hulk. When you start insulting me, I just get stronger. You know, I don't know if you saw that one movie, but, you know, they shoot him and he gets bigger. And that's how I am when atheists start insulting me. It doesn't bother me at all because I was just like them and I was probably worse, you know. So I have a lot of fun on Twitter. It's great. It's definitely a blessing.
Well, thank you for reaching out to me, and thank you for now using your life literally for the glory of God and saying, God, just use my memes, use my tweets, use the arguments that are yours, use those for your glory. That's just awesome.